The TEKS, or the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, are the standards that the state of Texas has determined that students should be able to know and do. There are three types of standards in the TEKS. They are readiness, supporting, and process standards. Readiness standards are assessed every year on the STAR test, and they involve deep learning and in-depth instruction. Supporting standards are the prerequisite for the subsequent year and are used for scaffolding. That means they support the learning of the readiness standards. And then finally, the process standards involve the ways students can demonstrate their learning, and they're assessed along with the readiness and supporting standards. So it's important that you can identify these types of standards in your unit so that you can evaluate what the student needs to learn, what skills they may need to practice in order to learn, and then demonstrate their learning. You can use the TEKS resource system, the instructional focus document there, to determine the standard type. Once you've determined your standard type, you then want to start to break down your standard. And breaking it down a standard means that you're going to divide the standard into different parts. So the first step in breaking down or unpacking the standard, sometimes it's called, is to identify the verbs in the standard. For example, in the following standard, which is Social Studies 3.15b, create and interpret timelines, the verbs to be identified are the verbs create and the verbs interpret. So once we have identified what our verbs are, we then need to determine the depth of knowledge. Determining the depth of knowledge that is required of our students utilizes Webb's depth of knowledge, and it's broken down into 4 levels. Level 1 is the lowest level and just requires that students are able to remember or recall information. Level 2 moves a little deeper into students making connections, such as classifying or organizing information. Level 3 moves even deeper, where students must engage in strategic thinking. They might be comparing, critiquing, drawing conclusions, justifying their thinking, or making inferences. And finally, in level 4, the deepest of Webb's depth of knowledge, students must extend their thinking by analyzing or synthesizing that information from multiple sources. They might be designing and producing products, and they're applying information from one discipline into another. By classifying the depth of knowledge of the verbs you've identified in your standard, you can more accurately determine the level of rigor that you need to provide for your students and select the appropriate learning strategies. In the example in the section above, we identified the verbs create and interpret in our standard. Because these verbs would require students to employ strategic thinking, to interpret, and then to extend their thinking by planning and designing a timeline, we know that we must reach the rigor of level 3 and 4 depth of knowledge. The final step in breaking down your standard is simply to identify the academic vocabulary. This is vocabulary from your content area that may be new to students and which students will need to learn to meet your objectives. Again, in the example we've used, timeline would be identified as our academic vocabulary for this standard. When we've completed breaking down our standards for a unit, we can then move on to creating the unit map.